Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Zhizhong Hua. I'm a third-year PhD student from EPFL, working on the topic of genomic privacy under the supervision of Professor Jean-Pierre Ribaud. And today I'm going to introduce to you a privacy-enhancing tool called GenoGuard for protecting genomic data and providing provable security against adversaries that can efficiently perform brute force attacks. And this is a joint project that involves research groups from EPFL, Duke University, and also the Jacobs Institute of Conai Tech. Okay, with the advent of the next generation sequencing technology, nowadays the cost of fully sequence the cost of fully sequence a whole genome has decreased rapidly. So a person can have his full genome sequenced by spending only $1,000. And many institutions are also taking this advantage to collect more and more genomic data, either for research, for medicine, or various other purposes. For example, several years ago, we were talking about 1,000 genomes project, but nowadays the situation is now moving to 1 million genomes project. And the phenomenon of collecting genomic data not only happens in hospital or research lab, but also happens in industry. For example, the company 23andMe are also collecting genomic data. And moreover, the things are moving not only in the companies that specially deal with genomic data like 23andMe, but also in the CS giants that are so familiar to us in the computer science community. For example, now Google wants to store your genomic data, and IBM and Microsoft are also collaborating with genetic researchers to do analysis on genomic data. And also, Apple has also recently announced that they are going to test your DNA data in their research kit program. In addition, people are now building a global alliance for genomics and health to define a common framework for effective, responsible, and secure sharing of genomic data and clinical data. And so security and privacy is a serious consideration when we're talking about storing, processing, and sharing genomic data. So to better understand the privacy problems here and to design robust countermeasures, we actually need to have a knowledge about the genomic data that we are dealing with. So next, I'm going to introduce to you some background about genomic data, not much, just the amount that can be handled and digested by computer scientists. So okay, in genomic data, the sensitive information that we care about is contained in what we call genetic variants. And among the genetic variants, the single nucleotide variants are the most common ones. So for this type of variants, it takes place on a single position of the genome. And usually for such a position, there are usually two possible values that can be observed. The one is called the major allele, the other is called the minor allele. And each individual has around 4 million SNVs, and which is a subset of 50 million SNVs that have been discovered so far. And one interesting and complicated thing is that these NVs, they are correlated with each other. So during this talk, I'm not going to discuss much about the models for these correlations, but they are investigated to detail in the paper. And the genomic data that we want to protect is called genotype, which is basically a sequence of SNVs. So if we consider a pair of chromosomes out of the 23 pairs in human genome, and for each SNV position, so there are 2 copies of alleles. So we can actually encode SNV by the number of minor alleles, which could be 0, 1, or 2. So basically, the genotype is just a sequence of these 3 values. Okay, as I mentioned before, these values contain much sensitive information. For example, they can indicate a person's predisposition to a certain disease, and there could be the case of genetic discrimination. Actually, there was a movie called Gattaca back in 1997 talking about how the genetic discrimination can lead to denial of access to health insurance, education, and employment. And actually, one important feature about genomic data is that it has long-term data value. So the data does not change, and also the data will be potentially very useful even beyond the lifespan of the data owner. However, nowadays, security and privacy solutions make the assumption about limiting the adversary's computing power, but we know that this computing power keeps increasing, and it is therefore threatening the security of existing solutions. Hence, we need a stronger protection. And to design such a solution, one thing is that we should eliminate or relax such a computational assumption. So for that purpose, we make use of a recently proposed crypto tool called honey encryption. Actually, the difference between honey encryption and conventional encryption is very straightforward. So in this example, consider an attacker that can decrypt the ciphertext with a correct key. Then he's going to recover the original message. In this case, it is string Q. However, using a wrong key will give him a wrong message or an invalid message. More formally, it is a message with extremely low probabilities. So in this case, it is a random string. So by doing this, then the attacker will know immediately that the key is wrong. However, with honey encryption, even with a wrong key, you can still.
Your slides are unsynced. Can you? Can you get into a no-good spot? Can you see these?
Yeah, I can see this one.
Can you tell them to stop when you're where you think you are?
Yes. But now I'm going to the next one. Yeah, this one. So.
Okay. Do you want to give us like rewind maybe 1 minute or so?
Okay, maybe I can go back to the.
Is his clicker working? Okay. Can you
Okay.
go back until you're?
Okay, for this slide.
Does your?
Okay, go back.
Okay. We can go past this one. Dataco is great.
This one?
Oh no, I'm saying forward. I'm sorry.
Forward.
Yeah, start with honey encryption. That sounds
Okay.
perfect.
Okay. Sorry for this. But then it is not synchronized on these two screens. Okay, maybe I can look at this one. Okay. As I mentioned, we use a crypto tool called honey encryption, which is recently proposed in last year. And the difference between honey encryption and conventional encryption is that with the conventional encryption, when you use a wrong key, you are going to get a message which has extremely low probability. But with honey encryption, you are going to get, even you decrypt the ciphertext, you are going to get a plausible message, which in this case, it is string R. So in this case, then the attacker has a hard time to tell which key is correct and which key is not. So the threat of brute force attacks is mitigated by using honey encryption. And okay, so the problem is that how honey encryption achieves this nice feature. So the magic is we don't encrypt the message itself, but we first use a distribution transforming encoder to transform the non-uniform message space to a uniform C space, and then we are going to encrypt the C in the C space. So in this case, the C is a 2-bit string. So you can see that in this case, we can have a perfect mapping between the message space and the C space if the C space has only 2 bits. Now I'm going to define what is called a perfect mapping. So we have an original message distribution denoted by Pn, which is also shown on the right figure. And then we are going to have another distribution, which is called the DTE message distribution, which essentially captures the probability of getting a message by decoding a randomly picked C in the C space. So if we think about this, look at this example carefully, then we can see that it is actually the two distributions, they are identical to each other. However, for most practical and useful case, this is not true. So the perfect mapping is hard or impossible to achieve because of the complex structure of the message space. So therefore, we propose GenoGuard, which is a specially designed solution on genomic data. We consider the total number of variants to be n, and then the probability of a sequence is going to be decomposed into a sequence of conditional probabilities based on the rule of joint probability, the chain rule of joint probability. So in this case, the big M notation with subscripts denotes the subsequence. So our solution is that to encode the sequence, by dividing the seed space in a traversal of the sequence. Again, I'm going to illustrate this with an example. Here in this example, the total number of variants is 3, and then the sequence to be encoded is 0 to 1. So in theory, we can actually use the interval of real numbers to represent the seed space for the convenience of representing probabilities. So in this case, the seed space, which is at the top of this tree, is going to be the interval from 0 to 1. So now suppose the probability of the first variant being equal to 0 is 0.6. Then the encoder is going to take out the subinterval from 0 to 0.6 and get which corresponds to 60% of the parent interval. And then suppose the conditional probability of the second variant is 0.1. Then the encoder is going to take out 10% of the parent interval and then get the subinterval from 0.54 to 0.6. And finally, suppose the conditional probability of the third variant is 0.3, then the encoder is going to do a similar trick, take out 30% of the parent interval and then get the final subinterval for the whole sequence. So if we look at this example carefully, then actually the size of the final subinterval is actually the probability of the sequence. So theoretically, if we can actually use infinite precision to represent the seed space, then again, we are going to have a perfect mapping between the message space and the DTE message distribution. However, in practice, we always need to fix the bit length of the representation. So now there will be the security loss due to this imperfect mapping. And depending on the policy of dividing the seed space during the traversal, some probabilities in the DTE message distribution is going to increase, while some others is going to decrease. And what we have shown in our work is that by designing the policy carefully, we are going to have a negligible security loss even because the mapping is imperfect. As an evaluation, we have implemented a simple brute force attack on our solution and on the conventional encryption on genomic data. So now here we assume that the attacker knows the correct key is among 1,000 passwords, and what he does is very simple. He decrypts the ciphertext with all these 1,000 passwords, and then he calculates the probability of each decrypted sequence. So on the graph, the x coordinate is the password, and then the y coordinate is the probability of the sequence. The red triangular symbol denotes the correct decryption, while the others denote the wrong decryptions. So on the left graph, you can see that with the conventional encryption, you can easily distinguish the correct key from the wrong keys. However, with our solution on the right graph, actually the correct sequence is buried among all the wrong decryptions. So then the attacker has no idea about which key is correct and which key is not. So to further show the promising value of our solution, we also consider the attacks with side information, such as the victim's phenotypic trace. In this talk, I'm only going to talk about the attacks with ancestry. However, you can find more details about the discussion on some other phenotypic traits, like the hair color and the gender of the victim. Okay, in genomic research, in genomics, the researchers usually use principal component analysis to determine the ancestry of a sequence. And first, they will extract the first two principal components of the data, and then they will make a clustering of the data based on these two components. Here is a very common result that you will get by using the data from HapMap project for these three populations. The first one is African people, the second one is European people, and the third one is Asian people. So now imagine the attacker has the side information of the victim's ancestry. Is it really the case that he can eliminate most passwords because the sequence decrypted with those passwords corresponds to different ancestries? Actually, our solution shows that the answer is negative. So our solution is robust against such kind of attacks. So the basic idea of our solution is that we are going to have different DTEs for different ancestries. For example, now suppose the attacker knows the victim's ancestry is European, then he's going to use the DTE for European to decode the sequence. However, even if he used the wrong password and he get the wrong sequence, but the sequence is always going to have the consistent ancestry. In this example, you can see that on the graph, the sequence denoted by the red symbols corresponds to the wrong decryptions, and which all falls into the cluster of the European. And it is consistent with the attacker's background knowledge about the ancestry information. And for many other traits which are very difficult to integrate into our solution, we also provide a thorough privacy quantification of the privacy loss in the paper. So you can check the paper for details. Okay, finally, we have performed a performance evaluation on our solution by implementing the solution in Python on a cluster with 22 nodes, with each node encrypting and decrypting a pair of chromosomes. So in this case, the black block here represents the number of SMVs for each chromosome, and the other plots represent the time that you needed to decode or encrypt the sequence. So actually, you can see that the encoding and the decoding time of our solution, it is almost linear with respect to the number of SMVs. And also, another thing is that you can see that the encoding and decoding time, they takes much more time than the password-based encryption that we use in the paper. However, we argue that this is reasonable because you can actually encrypt the whole genome within 50 seconds, which is depending on the chromosome that have the largest number of SMVs. Okay, to conclude, our proposed solution, GenoGuard, provides protection of genomic data against brute force attacks by taking into account a very special characteristic of genomic data. And some very interesting future investigations include extension of our methodology to some other sensitive data that may also share a sequential nature. And although I haven't discussed much about the models that we use to model the correlations among the SMVs, but in the paper we have used the best model that is up to date and also is stable in genomic research in the past decade. However, still, the one interesting future investigation and evaluation of our solution is for the privacy erosion if the data actually evolves little by little. Okay, to learn more about our solution, either you can, besides reading the paper, you can also check our source codes in this GitHub repository. And last but not least, to learn more about the topic of genomic privacy, don't forget the workshop Genomic on Thursday, May 21st. And this workshop is devoted entirely to this very interesting research topic, and you don't want to miss this. And we also have designed a website for this research community. You can check out the website by following the link genoprivacy.org. Thanks. I will take any question.
Thank you, Jitsung. Does anyone have any questions about genomic privacy? So I have a few. When you said there's a negligible security loss, can you give a little bit of a precise definition of that?
Actually, it depends on the security parameter that you set before you perform the hard encryption. So, and it is, I cannot remember the exact number, but it is 2 to the minus of 80. That's the bit length that you use for the setting up the.
Thanks. Yeah. Question on the right mic.
Hi, I'm Abigail from IBM.
Yeah.
I have two small questions. First, if I understood correctly, you need to know in advance all the probabilities of the different SNVs, right, to construct the
Yes.
tree. Okay. And the second question is for the phenotype attack that you described at the end. You also need to know in advance what external information the attacker is going to have to create those trees accordingly.
To create the trees?
To create the DTE or whatever you called it.
So actually for our solution, we have integrated ancestry information and also the gender information. But for the other, as I mentioned, for the other phenotypic traits, they are actually still an ongoing research in genomics. So it is very hard to integrate it into our solution because you don't have those probabilities. So one interesting So for that part, we have actually provided a detailed quantification of the privacy loss if the attacker actually have those informations, which we don't incorporate before the encryption.
Okay, thank you.
So I just had one more really quick question on a follow-up to that. So how well understood are these probabilities for the 50 million variants that we already understand?
So as I mentioned, the model that we use to model these probabilities and the correlation between the SMEs, the model is already proposed like a decade ago, and it is still the best model that the genetic researchers are using nowadays.
That's the model that predicts.
So the model does not change, but the probabilities, they keep updating little by little. However, it's not going to have a significant changes. For example, a major allele with the more frequent probability is not going to become a minor allele. So even though there are some minor updates on the distribution model, it's not going to affect the probability of the sequence significantly. Yeah.
Cool. Let's thank the speaker one more time.